Something happens after midnight. The world gets quiet. The notifications slow down. The demands of the day stop arriving. And something in you, something that spent the entire day slightly compressed, slightly held back, slightly less than what it actually is, starts to expand. Your thoughts get clearer. Your creativity wakes up. The ideas you couldn't quite reach during the day become suddenly, effortlessly available. The conversations you have at 2 a.m. feel more real than anything you said between 9 and 5. The version of you that exists after dark feels more like the actual you than the version that showed up to all those meetings, replied to all those emails, moved through all that daylight, doing what was expected. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you've always wondered why. Here's what's fascinating. What you're experiencing isn't a quirk. It isn't insomnia dressed up as creativity. It isn't procrastination pretending to be depth. There is a genuine, documented neurobiological reason why certain people come alive at night, and understanding it changes everything about how you see yourself and your relationship with the world. Let's start with chronobiology, the science of biological time. Every human being has what researchers call a circadian rhythm, an internal biological clock that regulates sleep, wakefulness, hormone levels, body temperature, and cognitive function across a 24-hour cycle. But here's what most people don't know. That clock is not set to the same time in everyone. Chronobiologists have identified distinct chronotypes, biological time signatures that determine when an individual's brain and body are at peak performance. Morning types, Larks, reach cognitive peak in the early hours. Their alertness, focus, and creative capacity peaks before noon. But evening types, Owls, follow a completely different internal timeline. Their cortisol peaks later. Their body temperature rises later. Their prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, creativity, and deep thinking, reaches full operational capacity hours after their morning-type counterparts have already peaked and begun declining. This isn't a choice. This isn't laziness or bad habits or a failure to discipline yourself into an earlier schedule. Research from the University of Toronto and multiple chronobiology labs around the world has confirmed that chronotype is significantly heritable, meaning it is substantially determined by your genetics. The night owl didn't decide to feel more alive at night. They were built that way. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the night owl experience isn't only about biology. There's something psychological happening at night that is distinct from what happens during the day. And it affects everyone, not just evening types. During daylight hours, your brain is operating under what psychologists call social performance pressure. You are being observed. You are expected to be a certain version of yourself. Productive, appropriate, responsive, on. Every interaction carries a subtle evaluation. Every response is measured against an implicit standard. The daytime self is, to some degree, always performing, always managing how it appears, always slightly edited. But at night, the audience goes home. The performance ends, and what remains, what emerges in that quiet, is something closer to the unedited version. The thoughts you actually think, the interests you actually have, the person you actually are when nobody is keeping score. Research on nighttime creativity consistently shows that evening hours produce higher rates of divergent thinking, the kind of thinking that makes unexpected connections, generates novel ideas, and sees problems from angles that daylight logic tends to miss. The reason isn't just biological peak performance. It's inhibition reduction, the social filters that keep your thinking appropriate, linear, and acceptable during the day gradually lift as the night deepens. And what comes through when those filters lift is often the most interesting, most authentic, most genuinely you thinking you do all day. And here's what nobody talks about. For many people who feel more alive at night, the day itself is genuinely exhausting in a way that goes beyond physical tiredness. For introverts, for highly sensitive people, for people who spend the daylight hours navigating environments that require constant social management, the day is a long performance with no intermission. By the time night arrives, the performance is finally, mercifully over. And what follows isn't simply relaxation, it's restoration. It's the self returning to itself after a long time away. The night becomes the only hours that belong entirely to them. The only time when the world isn't asking them to be something specific, to show up in a particular way, to produce and perform and respond on someone else's schedule. In those quiet hours, they read what they actually want to read. They think what they actually want to think. They create, explore, feel, and process in ways the daytime simply doesn't allow. Psychologists who study identity and self-concept have found that people with stronger night preferences often show higher scores on openness to experience, intrinsic motivation, and creative self-expression. The night doesn't just feel better to them. It is better in the specific ways that matter most to who they actually are. Let's be honest about something. Living in a world built around morning people is genuinely hard when you're wired differently. School starts early. Work starts early. The world's baseline assumption is that the optimal human being rises with the sun, peaks before noon, and winds down by 10. If your biology doesn't match that template, you have likely spent years being misread as lazy, undisciplined, or difficult. You've probably been told to just go to bed earlier, to fix your sleep hygiene, to get it together. None of that advice addresses what's actually happening, because the night owl's relationship with nighttime isn't a schedule problem. It's an identity problem, a mismatch between who they actually are and when the world expects them to be at their best. Now here's what's fascinating about the particular quality of nighttime aliveness that night owls describe. It isn't just that they function better, it's that they feel more like themselves, and that feeling of finally being fully present in your own experience is one of the most psychologically significant things a person can have. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote that the only serious question is whether life is worth living. Night owls have an answer. Yes, just not between 9 and 5. There is something quietly radical about knowing when you are most yourself, about recognizing that the world's schedule and your schedule are simply different, not because you failed to adapt, but because your brain runs on a different clock. A clock that keeps better time for certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of feeling, certain kinds of being. The night is not your enemy. It is not a bad habit. It is not something to fix or overcome or apologize for. It is, for the people who live there, the truest part of the day. And if the world doesn't quite understand why you come alive when it goes to sleep, that's okay. You don't need the world to understand it. You just need to understand it yourself. Subscribe to Brain Decoded for more psychology that finally explains the things about yourself that never quite made sense before. And the next time someone tells you to go to bed earlier, you'll know exactly what to tell them.